Good morning, everyone. My name is Merle Massey. I am the coordinator for undergraduate research at the University of Saskatchewan, and also the lead coordinator of the SURE program, which is our pilot program this summer. This morning we have Jill McMillan from the University of Saskatchewan Library, who's here to do some writing help with us on how we write a good literature review. And with that, I'm going to pass it straight over to Jill. Thanks so much for being with us.
Thanks for having me. So today's topic is all about writing your literature review. So I hope that you walk away from this session with some really practical strategies, as well as some resources that you can consult with going forward if you are producing this kind of text type, which is one of the most common, I would suggest, text types that you encounter in academia. So my name is Jill McMillan. If you ever want to get in contact with me, don't hesitate. Please send me an email, jill.mcmillan@usask.ca. I am a graduate writing specialist, but I can connect you to undergraduate supports as well. And some of the different events and supports that I offer are also available to undergraduate students. So I wanted to quickly highlight a couple of supports and events that are coming up before we get into today's session. So we do have free one-to-one writing support that is available to all University of Saskatchewan students. If you have never made use of this support before, I always encourage you to try it at least once to see if you find it valuable. I think if you are invested at all in becoming a better writer, it's very useful to connect with these kind of supports on campus. So you can make use of either email support, or you can have a virtual appointment with one of the writing tutors via WebEx. That has recently been set up, and they are very eager and happy to help students gain some perspective on their writing. We also have the USask Writing Help Guide that you can make use of as well. And these hyperlinks are all connecting to those sources that you'll be able to make use of when you receive a copy of this presentation. We have a couple of upcoming events as well that you might find interesting. Starting on Monday, we're having the first of a series of what are referred to as virtual write-ins. They're going to be facilitated by myself. And basically, these are 90-minute sessions that are broken up using the Pomodoro technique to just provide a bit of dedicated time and space to focus on writing projects. Because if you're anything like me during this time of lockdown and social isolation, you might find your ability to concentrate has been affected. And so this is just a way to connect with others and really give yourself permission to focus on a writing project that you might be working on. I also have a number of spring and summer workshops that are coming up in June. And these are available to graduate students as well as advanced undergraduate students. So if you're interested in any of these topics, from avoiding plagiarism or effective paraphrase to flow and coherence in writing, please join us for one of those sessions. So I'm going to turn off my video now as we get into today's session. So let's just take about 2 minutes. What are some of the things that you're hoping to learn today? And if you could contribute in the chat box, that would be fantastic. Okay, it looks like we have a range of hopes and goals for today, everything from just sort of getting a bit more organized and approaching the literature review, improving flow, how to incorporate sources. So we'll certainly be addressing some of these, and some of these concerns might be better met in a different session. But certainly, if you have any questions at the end of today's session and still want some additional tips or resources, please let me know and I will get that information to you, or we can have a quick chat about it as well. So thank you for sharing. Our agenda today, we are going to do a lot and try and do that all within the time that we have together. So we're going to quickly look at the writing process. We're going to then look at the nature and purpose of literature reviews, some strategies for organizing literature reviews, and this will be drawing a little bit on what was touched on during last week's session. And then we are going to consider the role of synthesis and how we can make use of language to signal critique. So a lot of different things that together I think can really bring the literature review into focus and break it down into a manageable task. So one thing to remember is that the review is a very interdependent process. So you've been, or a lot of you have been attending sessions with librarians, for instance, to learn about different research techniques and collecting all of those wonderful sources. We talked about analysis last week, and today we're going to focus a little bit more on writing. But as you actually start working on your literature review, you're going to find that sometimes these categories are much more interlinked than we might appreciate. So when we think of the writing process, for instance, we often think of this very linear structure where we go seamlessly from pre-writing, drafting, revision, editing, and publishing. This is what the writing process looks like in its ideal form. In reality, for a lot of us, it really looks a little bit more like this. It's a bit more messy, and that's perfectly fine. We are sometimes in the process of revising our literature review and then realize, oh, there's a section that I sort of forgot about. And then you have to start in a bit of drafting and then incorporate that section into the revision and the draft that you're working on. So I think remaining aware that the writing process can look a little bit messy is useful. And then the added complication, if we're looking at academic writing, is that you might need to pause for a moment during your writing process and actually go and do some additional research. Ideally, we have all of these sources collected before we start writing, but sometimes that's not the case. And so just knowing that you might have to go back and do a little bit of extra research is quite useful. And at this point, I feel that a lot of you are probably becoming experts in terms of making connections with people on campus. But just to reiterate, if you have questions about research, please connect with your liaison or subject librarian. You can make use of the little search directory in order to connect with the person who really knows how to connect you with the sources that are relevant to your discipline. Okay, so our next question. Why write literature reviews at all? Let's take, again, about 2 minutes and contribute in the chat box. Why write literature reviews? Oh, I love that phrase, bowing to the ancestors. That's fantastic. We're seeing a lot of, again, great contributions here. Really, we have multiple reasons for doing that literature review. So it's about understanding where our study, where our research question fits in to what's come before. It's going to help improve our own knowledge and understanding of the research topic. It's going to ensure that we are not accidentally replicating work that's already been done because we have limited time and resources, so we don't need to test the same questions in the same way anymore. Thinking about those concerns, those limitations that other people identified in their research and how we might circumnavigate those problems in our own research. So it can also be a way of helping to generate ideas for our own research and the methodology, for instance, that we might make use of. So again, fantastic responses. Thank you for all of your contributions. So in brief, the purpose is really about, okay, communicating what we know about a question or an area of interest, and even perhaps more significantly, what is not known about a particular topic. Because in this not knowing, we're starting to already provide a bit of justification for why more research needs to be done. So as we're pulling this information together, what we are doing, we're starting to highlight consensus that exists, where people agree, but we're also going to identify those gaps and those interesting debates that might be emerging within the academic area of interest. Because ultimately, what we want to do when we're writing a literature review is to determine where our work relates to that larger academic conversation. And it's also a way of sort of stepping into that conversation and giving yourself a voice and saying, this is why my work is important. This is what it's going to do. And so that's why literature review is so significant in academia. It is because it is providing ultimately that justification for all of the work that we're doing. So we have a couple of options. We're going to look very briefly at this first option, and then we're going to spend more time with the second option in terms of how you might conceptualize and structure your literature review. So the first option I present is the idea of the literature review as a story. Basically, you're creating a narrative for your reader so that they understand why you're doing what you're doing, why you're justified in the approach that you're taking, why your research is something that we should care about. And this can be done by answering a couple of questions. Here I've identified a couple of key ones, but certainly you could layer in some additional questions as well. But if you were to answer these 5 questions, really you would have a pretty effective literature review. So answering, well, what actually inspired my research? How does my research relate to what's been done before? And the big one, why does my research matter, right? Because there are lots of research questions that we could investigate, but whether or not they're contributing anything of significance might be debatable. So we want to explain why the work that we're doing is important. What will my research achieve? And who will my research impact, right? So if you're to answer all of these questions, and they don't have to be in this order, but certainly you'd be providing a very well-rounded review and justification for your work. So this is one option. The next option, and this is where we're going to spend a little bit more time, is this model known as create a research space, otherwise known as CARS model or CARS moves. And basically, this is a model that is very basic, but because of its simplicity, it is so useful and can apply basically to any literature review. And once you have awareness of this model, I think you're going to just see this in place in almost any literature review you read or encounter. So basically, this model has 3 rhetorical moves. The first is establishing research territory, identifying a gap, and then occupying the gap. And we're going to get into a little bit more detail on the next slide. So we're going to look at 2 examples starting with the next slides. But as we look at these samples, and we'll take about 3 or 4 minutes for each sample, I'd like you to contribute in the chat box and ask yourself, how have the authors made use of these CARS moves? So those moves, again, are establish a research territory. Another way of thinking about this, what's already been done? What have other people done in relation to this topic? The second move, identify a gap. So basically, what hasn't been done? What is unknown? And the third is occupying the gap. And this is where researchers step in and state what their project is all about. So we're going to look at one sample. And I apologize for the tiny font. The reality is we do have to look at quite a bit of text when we're looking at literature reviews. This is a text taken from a 2017 article from the Journal of Animal Feed Science and Technology. So I'd like you to read through, take about 4 minutes to read, and start identifying, hey, where are those CARS moves, if they're present at all? Okay, so we're starting to see where, hey, where is this research territory? Where is that potential gap? And how is this particular project addressing that gap? So let's break this down a little bit. So here, in this particular example, as already noted by many of you in the chat, those first 3 paragraphs really are elaborating on that research territory. Again, another way to conceptualize that is a problem that currently exists. So you might actually see authors making use explicitly of words like problem, for instance, to start signaling that this is an area of concern. But basically, in those first 3 paragraphs, we're really starting to elaborate on this context, this issue related to global climate change, and the need to look at other plants in order to feed particular types of livestock. And so this really starts to concentrate on the idea of the Jerusalem artichoke as a potential source that has been underexploited for use to feed livestock. And then as we move into that final paragraph, this is where we start to identify that research gap. What needs to be researched? And I've bolded and increased the font here in that first sentence, the second part of that first sentence. There is scarce information. I always see this kind of vocabulary as an academic or a researcher kind of shouting, right? It's like, oh no, we don't know information here. There's scarce information that's understudied. And this is really going to start to signal to readers that, oh, okay, this seems reasonable that we know all this other information, but we don't really know this information. And this then provides that little pocket, that little opening to then insert our current research. Hence, this trial was carried out to determine how, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So we have that occupation of that current gap of knowledge that exists. So let's look at another example. And maybe we'll take 3 minutes instead of 4 minutes. And I'd like you to go through the same process, because it's always possible to identify a model in one example, but it's not necessarily indicating that it's a generic model. So let's actually look at something that's quite different. Previously, we were looking at agriculture. Here, we're looking at marketing. So I'd like you to go through and see what kind of cars moves are present in this example as well. Okay, so again, lots of really great contributions in the chat. I think a lot of us are starting to quickly identify some of those cars moves. Just to the point that that second paragraph is quite long and a bit difficult to read. You might also notice some of the ellipses where I actually remove some information. So this paragraph in its published form is actually a lot longer. But for space, I had to remove some content here. But yes, certainly what we're seeing here is another example of how those really robust CARS moves can be applicable to a very different research context. So again, let's look at this in a little bit more detail. So unlike our previous example, where our paragraphs were more clearly aligned with those specific CARS moves, here we see that you can actually have a paragraph that incorporates multiple moves within that paragraph. It might make it a little bit more difficult for your reader. As always, you want to be mindful of your reader's needs to ensure that they're able to follow along really nicely. So if you would prefer to divide up your paragraphs more in keeping with those CARS moves, feel free to do so, but you're not restricted to that structure. So again, I think reflecting a lot of what people have already contributed, that first paragraph and the first part of that second paragraph are really about establishing, once again, that research territory. Here's a problem that exists. This is information related to this larger problem and what is known about this problem. And then, again, we're starting to make some use of some of those academic shouts in order to start identifying that research gap, what needs to be researched. So to better understand, calls have been made, more study is needed. Again, anytime someone's saying more study is needed, you know that they are starting to work up to their own research study. If anything's been identified as an understudied area, again, that is creating the space in which we get to then step into and say, hey, what about our current and fantastic investigation or study that we are presenting here today? We also seen some tone differences here. Here we're making use of first person plural, so we have the use of we. Again, this is something that's going to be informed perhaps by some disciplinary conventions, but certainly it is an option that is often available, that there is often space to have that personal voice in a literature review. Okay, so CARS moves. I hope that is one of the things you're going to walk away with today, that these rhetorical moves, really simple, but really robust and can be applied in so many contexts and can be a very effective way to conceptualize and as well as then organize your literature review. So now we're going to shift focus a little bit in terms of thinking about that organization in a more deliberate sense. And we're going to approach this primarily from a thematic approach. So when it comes to organization, a lot of your organization is likely to start to emerge within that pre-writing stage. In this moment, you are thinking about your reader, the information that your reader requires, as well as the ultimate intent of the text that you are developing. Having that text purpose and those reader needs in mind are going to then help inform the choice of structure. When it comes to literature reviews, there are three main options. You can organize by chronology, theme, or methodology, or sometimes you're going to start to see an almost hybrid approach emerge, which can also have some benefits. So we're going to focus primarily on the idea of a thematic organization. It's usually a preferred approach depending on your field of study. And one of the reasons why it's preferred is that it often encourages more effective development of analysis and synthesis, which is going to be a focus for us today. So this graphic might be a little bit familiar. If you joined us last week, we looked at this toward the end of last week's presentation when we were sort of thinking about how we might organize our sources. Here we're looking at the same image, but here we're just retitling it as organizing ideas, because ultimately this is how we are going to start working with our sources. We're going to start taking those central ideas from them in order to start making our own literature review. So this is just a generic structure that we might have in mind, where we have a couple of central themes, and some of these themes might have some sub-themes, and some of those sub-themes might have some sub-themes within them. But the great thing about a structure like this is you can start to play around as well. So the example, again, similar to last week, looking at this idea of bone fractures in elderly populations, we might think of bone density, interventions, costs, demographic shifts, and then some of these sub-themes related everything from bone formation to stem cell therapy, before reaching a consensus in terms of what the ultimate intervention might be. But we might decide, actually, when we look at this structure, there might be some redundancies. We might be able to organize in a more concise and effective way. And so when we are in that pre-writing stage, we really want to make use of the fact that we haven't committed to anything at this point. And so having that flexibility, moving things around, if you have Post-its, go completely crazy with Post-its, moving them around, because here you're still in that conceptualizing phase. Yes, it might be that later on when you're drafting, you might have to do some major reorganization as well. But if you play around with these concepts and ideas earlier in the writing process, it's going to likely mitigate or minimize the likelihood of having to do major structural changes to all of the text that you've produced. Because that's a little bit more difficult to start moving chunks of text around. But it can be done, and often it might be necessary, and that's fine as well. But if you can put a little bit more attention on organization initially, then you might save yourself some time later on. And so when we were talking about the hybrid approach a little earlier, I said that, okay, sometimes you're going to incorporate different elements of these different structures. And here I've just used some arrows to indicate where you might be pulling in those concepts related to something like chronology, for instance. So it might be that when you were writing about bone density, you might look at this from the perspective of changing ideas or changing knowledge related to how we understand bone density, for instance. And so this information might be presented in a chronological way within a larger thematic structure. In the same way, when you're looking at different interventions, here are stem cell therapy, weight-bearing exercises, and balancing exercises, you might decide within those sub-themes that you're actually going to organize this information according to the methodology used by other researchers in order to help assess which intervention is most effective. So when we are talking about themes, know that within those larger themes, you also have that flexibility to think about chronology as well as methodology. So I think this is one of the reasons why I like the thematic approach so much. It's because it provides you a nice framework for pulling in these other structures if they suit the needs of the text that you're producing. Okay, so moving along. So we've thought about organization, and now we're going to start thinking about analysis. We spent quite a bit of time on this topic last week, so what we're going to focus a bit more on is some of the language that we can make use of to signal the fact that you've been thinking about the literature in a critical way. So just to sort of recap from last week, by asking critical questions, we are creating the foundation for the critique, and this is going to help create a more effective literature review. So the questions we're asking of sources relate to credibility of work, significance of work, methodology, data results, and conclusions. If you'd like to go back to last week's presentation, at some point in the future, we had a lot of specific questions related to all of these categories. But pivoting a little bit, I'd like to focus a little bit on how we can actually make use of language in a very deliberate way to signal to our reader that we have critically engaged with sources. And because we're academics, we do this in a fairly subtle way, but as we gain more knowledge and awareness of these rhetorical options, we start to understand the tone of the text that ultimately we're trying to emulate. And we start to become more aware of when academics and researchers are actually being very critical in how they are evaluating the work of someone else. So here we have a couple of samples. And when we initially look at them, they all seem pretty diplomatic, right? Sample 1, the authors present a plausible case for, less convincing is their treatment of. Sample 2, the authors must be commended for taking on the difficult task of, unfortunately. Sample 3, the study is an ambitious undertaking. This effort, however, is not entirely successful. Sample 4, the authors provide a detailed study of an interesting topic, but the research suffers from exhibits can be criticized for. So all sounds very, very nice. But when we step back a little bit, we realize, okay, this kind of terminology, this kind of vocabulary is really signaling that, wow, there's something to be criticized in how someone else approached this topic or tried to answer this research question. Because as someone who knows a lot about this topic, I'm not persuaded, I'm not convinced by the approach that they took. And so this element of critique and criticism is really starting to come through that language that's being used. But it is still civil. It is still very diplomatic. Okay, so from language, we're going to step back a little bit again to think about organization. These are very interrelated concepts. And we'll go back to language again shortly. A pitfall that I want to bring to your attention is a tendency sometimes to structure literature review as one study summary after another, almost like a list. And we're going to look at an example, and I'd like you to ask yourself, what might be the limitations of this approach? Let's take a minute or two. I'm just trying to keep an eye on time. What might be a limitation of this approach? Okay, so once again, some really great contributions from the group. So we don't really have a sense of how studies relate to each other. We don't have an idea of a larger picture starting to emerge. We don't have a sense of, well, is one study more trustworthy than the other? We don't have that sense of critique. And so as a reader, we might be asking ourselves, why am I reading this? Like, what additional value am I getting from reading this as opposed to just going to these original studies? And so it can create a really negative impression because the reader just starts to feel that maybe they're wasting their time a little bit. So it's an example where there's no value added. We just don't have a sense of why someone has shared this information with us. In contrast, we might ask, well, how do studies actually relate to each other? Because in addition to asking those critical questions of individual studies, which was something that we focused on last week, we also want to ask ourselves, well, how do studies actually relate to each other? So let's again take a minute or two. What might be an advantage of an approach like this? So using this reference to the same research studies, but presenting the information in a different way. Okay, again, some really fantastic feedback from the group. Thanks again for all of your contributions. So we're seeing that we're able to bring in a little bit of our own critique. And we also have a sense of, wow, there's some thought that's been put into this. Information is organized in a much more deliberate way. We start seeing how there is a larger narrative in this field. And it is becoming much more compelling to us as readers as a result. There's more value added here. We also see even just the structure has changed. We have paragraphs that are a bit more robust as well. So we have that really lovely sense of voice that is starting to emerge, the notion of an authorial point of view or perspective. Because that literature review, it's saying something about us as researchers as well. It's saying something about our ability to engage with other people's work and not just our own particular study. So it's providing awareness that we understand the purpose of a review. And we are also, as readers, starting to understand, okay, this is an interesting and complex conversation in the field of study. And I might be more compelled to pay attention as a result. So again, all of this wonderful thematic organization can start to happen in that pre-writing stage. And the trick is then to take all of those wonderful ideas that we have in terms of how we might structure our work, and then start to layer in the actual studies. So here we start to see, and this is just a generic example. If we were to start layering in those studies that have started to inspire the structure of our thematic literature review, we start to see, oh, okay, well, in my paragraph on bone formation, for instance, I might pull in reference to these 3 particular studies. And so already we're starting to foster an environment where there's going to be more opportunity to have that sense of relationship be established through comparison and contrast. And in promoting comparison and contrast, we are starting to generate the idea of synthesis. And synthesis is fantastic because what it's doing is demonstrating that we understand those major themes, trends, the relationships that are emerging. And this is as simple as showing, hey, these are how some research studies are similar, and these are how some of them are different, and this is why it's important. And in doing so, we are then more able to situate our own work in that larger academic conversation related to our topic. It's also usually a lot more interesting to read as a result. Here we have two samples. I'd like you to take 2 or 3 minutes and just indicate which sample do you prefer and why. Okay, so we had a flurry of responses. It seems that sample 2 has it. So there's reference to it is more concise, it gets rid of worriness. We're getting the same information, but more quickly, more succinctly. And that is one of the huge benefits of synthesis. Synthesis is great because it also improves readability. As academics, we're used to having to get through a lot of information on a regular basis, and it can get really annoying if we are encountering a writer who just goes on and on at length as opposed to getting to the point a little bit more quickly. And what we see here is our ability as writers to make use of our awareness of synthesis to improve the reading experience for the person who's coming to look at our text. So here, in that first sample, we're able to identify, hey, okay, what are these related points? And then place that information into our own words more easily. If you're someone who struggles a little bit with paraphrase, aiming for synthesis is a really fantastic way to provide more flexibility to your language and help you avoid getting stuck when paraphrasing. So, what types of questions can we actually ask to start generating synthesis in the first place? So let's take 1 or 2 minutes. The hint that I'm going to give is think of the relationships between studies. What kind of questions can we ask about the relationships between studies? Okay, again, once again, some really great contributions in the chat. a lot of activity around this question of methodology. Are they using similar or different methodology? If they're using similar methodology, did they receive the same result? If not, what might account for this? If they use different methodology to investigate a similar question, what was the rationale behind this? Those are really, really good and effective questions to ask, and they will be very effective in helping to generate that synthesis that we're looking for. I've just collected some very basic questions that you might use. Again, they're meant to be applicable across a range of disciplines, and as a result, they're pretty basic. But it doesn't mean that they don't have value, because ultimately it is about that comparison and that contrast. So are researchers asking similar or different questions about the same topic? Do scholars agree? Do they contradict each other? What debates are emerging? This is especially important if you're seeing that interpretation of information be quite different, which relates to the next question. Do researchers interpret data in similar or different ways? Which one do you think is stronger? Why? What methodologies have been used to investigate comparable questions? How were scholars responding to previous research? I know that there was a question about, does one study cite another? And that relates very nicely to this last question. How does the research fit into the current academic conversation? So having these questions in mind and being quite deliberate in asking them of different studies is going to naturally produce a lot of really great critical insight, engagement, as well as produce that synthesis for your literature review. We're now moving a little bit back to some language considerations. Again, we can make use of language in a very deliberate way in order to signal that we've asked these questions of these studies. And ultimately, they are going to connect primarily to notions of similarity or comparison, as well as dissimilarity, difference, or contrast. So when it comes to that similarity and comparison, we're looking at words like similarly, both, also, similar research, likewise, corresponds, related. All of these keywords are starting to signal that, hey, there's a nice connection that is linking these studies together. However, if you want to signal that sense of contrast, you also have a lot of vocabulary available to you. Contrary, on the other hand, contrast, unlike, conversely, but, while, however. However is probably one of the most popular words in academic writing because it's so useful to signal that sense of difference or contrast. One of my absolute favorite resources out there as it relates to academic writing is the Academic Phrasebank at the University of Manchester. I talk about this a lot when I'm doing workshops, simply because it's such a great resource if you are someone who is invested in developing as an academic writer. So it might be that you want more options to phrase your critique of someone's work, or you might want more skeleton frames or skeleton sentences for approaching that sense of comparison and contrast. I encourage everyone to take a few minutes to explore it at their leisure and find out if they think it's going to be a valuable resource for them. I certainly find it's a really nice resource, especially if you find that you're always relying on the same phrasing, which can get really boring, both for yourself as a writer, but also for your reader, if they're encountering the exact same structure and phrasing all the time. So I'd like to just spotlight synthesis in action. This is going to hopefully be a familiar sample. It's again related to the acoustic environment of those different sounds, nails on chalkboard, et cetera, And I just wanted to highlight very visually here what synthesis looks like in an extended piece of academic writing. So here we have two paragraphs, And within the parentheses, we start seeing, oh, okay, we have multiple studies referenced here. And just that visual cue is going to signal to your reader that, oh, there's synthesis in this text. So it's very, very subtle, but it's a way of signaling your sophistication in terms of being able to manipulate information and organize information in a unique way. Likewise, if we look at another familiar sample, we see synthesis in action here as well. Of course, you might see, actually, this Kays and Nottingham 2008 study, that seems to be cropping up very frequently. And you know what? Sometimes that happens in academic writing. But what's key is that we're not just seeing this study being referenced by itself in a paragraph. Even in that second paragraph where that citation is starting to dominate, we do have reference to a 2013 study as well. So sometimes it might be that because our work is closely related to the work that someone else has done, we are going to draw perhaps what seems a little bit disproportionately on one or two sources, but we want to be very intentional in terms of thinking of how we can pull in synthesis and relate those studies that might be dominating to other studies as well to create that sense of synthesis. So a couple of takeaways and next steps. Literature reviews, all about justifying your research, and making use of those CARS moves can help make this justification just easier. They're really robust. They can relate to so many different disciplines. When possible, organize information thematically because it helps improve readability as well as promote the synthesis of research. Synthesis is so essential because it demonstrates higher order thinking and communicates your point of view as a researcher in your field. And you can make use of language in a very strategic way to guide and engage your reader and reinforce for them that you have thought about this information in a really sophisticated and in-depth way. So going forward, depending on the deliverable that you are working on over the next couple of weeks or months, you might want to gather a sampling of literature reviews from your field, especially if there is that goal to publish, for instance. You might want to target what literature reviews look like in those particular journals to get a sense of the style, the organization, the structure. Making use of your knowledge of CARS moves, for instance, and your awareness of synthesis. Ask yourself, how are these reviews being organized? Having that level of awareness will make writing your text easier. In a similar way, analyzing the language that's used. So in your discipline, what kind of vocabulary is popularly used to signal critique, for instance? And it's one of those things where we're trying to train ourselves to interact with text in perhaps a slightly different way. So we want to look for style as well as content. In academia, we're usually just reading for content, but as we are developing as writers, we want to create a really nice mental framework for ourselves to better understand how structure or language is going to facilitate the communication of our work to someone else. And simply having genre awareness just makes it easier to meet expectations. And this is a skill that transfers far beyond academia as well. So if you find yourself in a situation where you've been asked to write a memo or report or slide deck, for instance, in a business environment, gaining that familiarity of, well, what are the expectations? What are the characteristics of these text types, these genres? That's just going to give you more confidence when you approach the creation of that sort of text. I've included a couple of recommended resources that you might wish to make use of. I'd like to also reiterate that your university library is always here to help. We might be remote right now, but all of our services, or the vast majority, of our services are still up and running. If you're looking for one-to-one math or stats help, for instance, those appointments have recently been launched. If you have questions about study skills, research support, writing help, we have all of those resources available to you. If you have any questions, I can stick around, or you can email me at jill.mcmillan@usas.ca. And I just want to remind you again of some of those upcoming events. So if you want to join our virtual write-in, that starts on Monday. If you're interested in attending any future workshops, please don't hesitate and feel free to register. And if you have nothing to do, at 1 o'clock today, I will be participating in Conversations with USAS, which is a WebEx event that happens, I think, every 2 weeks and features conversations with USAS professionals. And so students are invited to come in and ask questions starting at 1 o'clock. So thank you so much. I went over time by a minute or two, so thank you for your patience. But if you have any questions, please feel free to ask or send me an email, and I'll just leave the final slide up for now. And I will also magically reappear on screen.
Thank you very much, Jill, for being with us today. I'm just going to close the session, the recording of the session. And if anyone has any particular